Great. Thank you so much for the introduction, Ben. And I'm really excited to present some of our results from when we started launching this methodology for load testing using vision-based measurements. So this is the first of a series of tests. So one thing I like about this work, it shows kind of the raw, uncut, pure nature, kind of where we started. I'd also like to acknowledge the co-author of the paper, Luke Timber, who is a graduate student at the University of Delaware. And this is a project funded by the CMTIS UTC from Penn State, where we actually had collaborators from George Mason University as well as the University of Delaware. So for this talk today, I'm going to give you this, essentially the motivation for this work was to verify the accuracy of these vision-based measurements. And I'll kind of talk about kind of like what the old school, more so traditional methods and conventional ways of having contact sensors to do our load testing, and then how we're using these vision-based measurements to understand particularly displacements. I'll walk you through our diagnostic load tests of a bridge in Delaware. So we had a lot of in-kind support from our Delaware Department of Transportation to do the load test. I'll discuss our findings, and I'll conclude with a summary of our findings and lessons learned. So as we're all aware, we do load testing in a way that requires a lot of time and these contact sensor arrays that are used. So what we're proposing through these vision-based measurements is a non-contact way of utilizing cameras and very robust digital image correlation algorithms that really essentially are doing point-to-point tracking. So we can look at this as kind of like on the left being more of our conventional method that requires a lot of time, effort to mount these sensors, and then doing it in a way that sets up cameras in maybe 30 to 40 minutes to set things up to actually compute the measurements. So we had some very serious questions and concerns as to the accuracy of these methodologies and really trusting it in a way to do, particularly to understand the live load distribution. So the way it works is that we have these hanging targets here that are these bullseye that essentially the camera utilizes, again, these DIC algorithms and this non-contact method to look at 2D deformation vectors. So while targets are not necessarily required, they do help in the accuracy of the results in monitoring in real time. So what you see here on the left are, we have two cameras essentially, that's through the iMetrum dynamic monitoring system, where we actually we've moved now towards moving targets, hanging targets. But on this test that I will talk about for our diagnostic load test, we actually just have these targets or placards within the web of the girders. So essentially the camera is doing point-to-point tracking and utilizing video gauge software through the system controller. So it does not take a lot of time, but what the targets enable is for one to understand what that known measurement is. So let me see if I can put this laser pointer on. So we know the actual measurement of this square target. So it helps us to calibrate the planes that is in plane of the anticipated movement of the displacement so that we can calibrate these planes with that known preference that helps with the point-to-point tracking. So what the planes look like here is essentially through the software system, we can map what the actual known measurement is to that known plane, and then everything is calibrated according to that known reference. So one good thing about this system is that as long as you have the accurate field of view, for the vision-based measurement, you can even go back in and look at different planes or different surfaces that are in question to then track the displacement or that point-to-point monitoring. So it's mainly focused on 2D behavior, out-of-plane movement, requires a little bit more work with 3 cameras to actually do the correlation properly. So what we were really interested in is seeing how we can do a side-by-side test with our conventional mounted sensors, particularly strain sensors and string pots, and actually do it side-by-side with understanding what our displacements are with our system. We did not have as much luck with looking at our 2D strain mapping with our system. So this presentation mainly focuses on distributions and looking at how we're able to understand the distribution for this load test. So this is a bridge that had no plans in Delaware, which is quite interesting because it looks pretty new and fancy. But apparently, for whatever reason, we were not able to have access to the bridge plans. But DelDOT said this was a bridge that's worthy for us to have access to it. So it consists of 6 steel girders with a concrete deck on top of about 8.5 inches. The girders are spaced 9 feet apart with 4 diaphragms, essentially at the end spans, the third and 2/3 span. So there are actually just 2 lanes of traffic with 2 shoulders on each side of the lane with a total inner to inner dimension of about 48 feet. So looking at the bridge cross section, our diagnostic load test is consisted of a total of 10 passes. So we did some dynamic runs at the end, but this presentation mainly focuses on our rolling passes that we had. We had 3 axle trucks, 2 of them. One was around 61 kips in weight, and the other one was about 65 kips. So again, we have our 6 girders in the cross section with our 2 lanes here. So we also noted that the actual where our girder placement was in the lanes weren't totally lined up. So we were really able to look at the distributions and how the load was transmitted in a unique way. So again, here's our test matrix of our load test. I'm mainly going to be focusing on the tests 1 through 4. These rolling passes where essentially we either had 1 truck in lane 1, then followed in lane 2, or looking at their pass on shoulder 1 in lane 1. So in total, we had 24 mounted sensors for our sensor array. We had our string pods along the midspan attached to the underside of each girder, as well as strain gauges that were mounted at the midspan, at the other third point, and then of course at the end span. So again, 24 sensors. So it took about 3 hours to mount all of these gauges. And whereas for the iMetrum system, which we have these 2 cameras on these tripods, essentially we were set up in about 30 minutes. So we really wanted to see how accurate the results were. But part of our challenge was understanding where to place the cameras for the best field of view. Given the location, we want to make sure that the cameras, again, have minimal skew and minimal distortion to help optimize the DIC algorithms. So because it was, again, our first test, we played a little bit with the positioning of the cameras and moved them throughout some of the tests. So it made it a little bit more difficult as we were trying to look at the full distribution where we had to actually do a little bit of stitching for the results, and I'll talk about that. But essentially, we were really primarily focused on the displacement and then had the conventional sensors there for placement. So the aqua color shows our 1 camera that actually has a finer field of view, and then our other camera 37, which actually is our high-speed camera. So in utilizing these measurements enables one for real-time viewing of the data, which is really nice. We can actually change the scope on the fly, as well as understanding what is going on, or even looking at a different factor even after the test. So because we have this video post-processing capabilities, again, we can look at different points on the girder or in different places. So what you see here is the yellow is we want to avoid any overexposure, but for these shots, they're really good. So you're able to see that for test 0, 1, and 2, that we were really focused on girders 3, 2, and 1. And then for tests 5 and 6, we were really focused on girders 3, 4, 5, and 6. But actually, again, the cameras were moving, so that was kind of a disadvantage. So in kind of knowing where you really want to focus or just getting the best field of view of all the girders is ideal for placement. So again, we're focusing on the first couple of tests. We had our individual truck passes followed by our tandem truck pass for test 2. So the first, these plots show here on the left is our results of test 1, where the y-axis shows our displacement where the target is actually placed within the web, compared to the actual string pod that is attached to the underside of the girder, really in contact with it. So on the left is test 1, right test 2. In blue shows the results from our dynamic monitoring system, and the orange shows our results from the string pods. We notice in general that we're really relatively hitting the peaks of the same time. We're about around 0.12 or so, 1.3 inches. Where we actually also noted too, this is for truck 1 and then followed by truck 2. We actually noted that our string pods bottom out a little bit. So we have a very more of an antiquated BDI system, which kind of begged the need for why we were trying to see and use technology in a unique way with this non-contact monitoring. But overall, we were able to see that, again, these are small displacements, right? So we were able to see that we were able to get relatively reasonable measurements for test 2, if we just look at the mapping there. So just noting for the iMetrum system, we're able to get an accuracy within its claimed 1/1000th of an inch, which is really accurate. So we were really concerned how we could verify these sensors, even with our very uninformed positioning of the camera. So we're quite pleased to see that. And then with the 2 trucks, and we saw that superposition was pretty valid when we actually put these 2 together. So that was really nice to see. So again, the next series of plots kind of just show the results and how we were able to calibrate the planes. Again, you can see superimposed underneath that overlay target is our bullseye. And we're really looking at girder 1, 2, and 3 there, particularly at the web there. So one of the things that we modified was actually, and others have done this before, of having these hanging targets so that we're really tracking that bullseye point that's really at the point of interest for the displacement. So again, we noted some issues that we were having with our string pot, but overall we saw a very nice mapping of our iMetrum system, and the displacement is a function of time when we compared it to the string pot. And likewise, when we focused on girder 3, where we actually had another camera that was focused there and then calibrating that plane with the known target, again, we were able to get some very similar results for what we were expecting, where girder 3 was closer to the midspan. So that really kind of led us to understanding the bigger picture and how the loads were distributed. So on the y-axis is essentially our girder distribution factor, for which we were able to compute for test 1. And again, because we could not get all 6 girders in one shot, this is a little bit of a composite result of stitching together some of the results, some of the single passes, to get a full perspective. So based on the legend, we can see here that truck 1 for the BDI and truck 1 for the iMetrum, so the blue and green pretty much are quite mapping on top of each other. And then also for the consequent shapes, we're able to see a pretty good correlation, at least of there's not much distance or not much separation between these points. So we were able to really see this distribution that we were expecting, where that for this set of tests, we noted that we were able to get more accurate results when the cameras were focused on those particular girders. So in this suite, we had the cameras focus more on girders 1, 2, and 3. So we were able to get some pretty reasonable results that match closely between what we were just comparing, essentially the strains and that distribution versus the displacement distribution. So one of our bigger research questions was really understanding, is there a way that, given the advantages of doing a load test in a non-contact way, and we're able to verify that we're able to get pretty accurate displacements, is there a way that perhaps we can in the future propose a method that we could use or perform a load rating in a way where we are taking these displacement distributions and understanding that in another proposed way to help minimize the time and the amount of traffic that it takes to stop traffic. So again, on the right shows another composite view of stitching all together for and now including girders 4 and 5, where again, because the camera positioning was a little bit further apart, we noted the differential there into those results in terms of understanding the distribution. Recall that for test 1, the trucks were closer to girders 3 and 4. But because our positioning of our cameras were not in alignment with that, that's one of the lessons learned in understanding how the system works. When we look at test 2, which was our tandem trucks, and understanding the girder or the relative girder distribution at the midspan, again, focusing on girders 1, 2, and 3, we're getting a pretty nice matching between what we saw with the displacement measurements, and then performing kind of what that relative distribution would be compared to what we saw with the in-contact strain gauge sensors. And likewise, when we actually kind of put it all together with the field of view, note the blue is just the strains that we had from our strain gauge measurements of the blue dots we're able to look at the distributions and see that even still, the imetrum now in this case is essentially undershooting, or if we were just looking at displacements compared to, again, deformations as strains. But we were really happy to see that although we're talking a small difference, we were able to was happy to see that it was quite comparable. Next, again, looking at our test 3, which consisted again of our rolling passes, but then focusing on the shoulder and lane 1. So that means the shoulder and lane 1, we're actually really emphasizing or seeing the load on girders 4, 5, and 6, where we had positioned the cameras. So again, looking at the grouping of the green and blue and the orange and red, we're seeing a really nice kind of mapping there from these two kind of different ways of looking at deformation, of course, strains and then displacements. But if we look at the overall distributions, we're able to see some similar patterns there. Similarly with the tandem truck, with the 2 trucks at heavier loads, again, we're now seeing a trend where the imetrum displacement in terms of distributions undershoots a little bit, but that's not too far off. So when we look at the distribution factors from the 2 tests, these 2 tables show in aggregate our final strains that we got for test 1 and 2, where we're actually seeing from test 1, it makes sense that girder 3, where the load was closest to, saw larger amounts of loads in both of those tests. These are the readings from our imetrum system. And so we were able to actually compute the live load distribution factors, which you saw the graphical representation of it. And then kind of this more of a qualitative approach for looking at the similar distributions, but using the displacement measurements. Note here that for girder 6, because we were actually, this girder 6 was the furthest girder location from our cameras. Again, we were able to note some differences in the measurement, but overall, we were really, really pleased to see that response. So in addition to the field measurements, we made a very simple model in SAP, and we also did a single girder align analysis using brass girder. So as noted from some of the other presenters, and this is again just for this case, we noted that the AASHTO calculations, which again, as was noted by the other speakers, don't assume composite behavior, but it provided a slightly more conservative distribution factor for 1 lane and multiple lanes if compared to what we would have computed from our field test for flexure. For the brass single line girder analysis, they're slightly higher for the 1 lane, but that was also where we assumed that that 1 girder was taking 25% of the deflection there. So that's kind of how we came up with that. And for our SAP model, we were able to utilize some of the field measurements to calibrate the fixity at the end. I know one of the other speakers was talking about adjusting these factors. So we were able to adjust the stiffness modification factor of the deck slightly to understand and try to achieve what we would get for the distribution factor. We also just did the basic computations from AASHTO as it relates to shear, but the focus of this was mainly on flexure for this work. So in summary, we were able to show that our imetrum system, our dynamic monitoring station, was able to, even from a non-contact way, get similar displacement measurements, and really helped us to map and understand that we were able to get the distribution of the live load in a very comparable way. So we were really, really pleased to see that. And we've even extended this work for looking at other bridges to really come up with a proposed methodology for how we could even use the displacements in this way. We also noted that another benefit of being able to kind of come in and utilize the system in a non-contact way is then we can get a better idea of the fixity and end conditions, and then be able to utilize this data to better calibrate either finite element models or different models that are typically used when trying to come up with the load rating. So again, another advantage for how we could utilize this system. And moreover, investigating kind of more the next steps of what we're working on now is how we can utilize this information, particularly from the displacements and understanding distributions. And it worked out for this one bridge, of course, right? We understand that we're looking at a suite of bridges, but for this one bridge, we saw that kind of nice parallel distribution. But we're really looking and focused on how we can utilize this information to calibrate other models and really kind of understand how we can utilize this system in a more effective way. So kind of like the takeaways from kind of the vision-based measurements. Again, let me go back. This was our teammates from UD and the George Mason crew, where they were really focused more on kind of phase-based measurements. So we essentially kind of married the phase-based measurements that George Mason focused on with what UD focused on, with this kind of more dynamic monitoring station really focused on displacements. And then also the third system that we compared to was our more conventional contact sensors of the strain gauges and the string pots. So what do we learn from these vision-based methods? Well, we clearly saw that we understand that with the mounted sensors, because you're in direct contact with the girder, we're able to get that more localized phenomenon, that behavior. Kind of the downside was more so, it takes a lot of time to set these up, particularly when you have multiple sensors and multiple locations. And we had to shut down the traffic and have MOT to help with the traffic and also access, right? We saw we had to have that kind of cherry picker bucket truck to kind of help us to access it. So it took about 3 hours compared to 30 minutes with a dynamic monitoring system, where we were able to later, after the test, rerun the test in this kind of video mode and look at different sections or different areas. So it was really nice and enabled us to be able to post-process the data in a unique way. Again, the system was easy to set up. We could see the results on the fly. So that also kind of prompted us to, because we could see the results in real time, that's why when we first started this test, we were looking at many different configurations and setups of the camera, maybe doing too much for the first test. And just really understanding how it worked, but we could see the results in real time. So that was really helpful, as opposed to kind of going back to the office and needing to post-process things. But in a very loose, kind of quick way, we were able to get kind of ballpark results on the screen. So some things to note: we have the targets there, and then now we added those hanging targets so that we're really tracking that point of interest. But we also noted that even during a test, any changes in lighting, any skew effects can also affect the results in the data, or we can even see some more noisy data, which was also observed in some subsequent tests. But even the fact that if in your field of view for these vision-based measurements, you can use a gusset plate or any type of texturing or contrast in the field of view, could now be a new point for point-to-point tracking. Surprisingly enough, we've even used graffiti that's been on a bridge, particular steel girder, but even can be done for concrete systems. But even just anything that has that contrasting kind of static point for that point-to-point tracking, again, to have that known reference or measurement. So even for the graffiti, you'd have to have that point or put some nodes there, but it's definitely a lot easier to use than kind of more traditional systems that require a speckling pattern with very finite detail. So we realized that this was a great system to use, and we were able to feel confident with the accuracy that we got. So with that, I start to bring my presentation to a close. Again, I'd like to acknowledge the CMTIS Region 3 University Transportation Center for funding this work and our students. Of course, for DelDOT for their in-kind support. It was great. I even had 2 undergraduate researchers on the project, which was awesome. But on the picture on the left, I like to end with, this is us at the bottom with our setup. Like, there is also a tough pad, a tablet that could be used, but we just like using and setting up the computer so that we can have a bigger screen. But you can see kind of like new school versus old school. My dear colleague, Trip Shetton, who's really climbing on the bridge and kind of making sure everything's mounted there. So it was a really nice marriage between understanding the complexities and intricacies that are involved with mounting sensors, but also now how we can take that to the next level using these vision-based measurements. So with that, I conclude my presentation and open the floor for any questions. Thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Monique. It looks like there are a few questions, both in the Q&A and the chat. First one is about the speckled pattern you mentioned. Will you consider using that in the future to get field strain data and not just displacement?
Right. Yeah, we're definitely considering that because I think once we can couple the idea of understanding getting a strain kind of, but it will be for like a 2D, right? A 2D strain. If we can really get that in a unique way, that would really push this work to the next level and then have the displacement measurements to complement that. So that is something that we are looking into for the future.
Great. Another one here is compared to the traditional methods, is there an estimate for the cost of labor and equipment to kind of start up?
Yeah. So I've also been having to answer that online, but I'll put it to you this way. When I was talking to our Del Dot folks and I told them how much, we invested in the system, they said that paying for maintenance of traffic alone in 1 year could pay for that system. So it is a little bit of an investment on the front end of a couple thousand dollars. But with that, because of the cost benefit analysis, it was like, oh, we could really utilize this so we don't have to stop traffic and then get people to be upset with us. So I think it has its advantages. I also see here, did you use a visual target? So another thing, I think it's a great question, Mustafa, that I did not bring up. So what we're also able to do is have virtual LVDTs and other type of sensors. So we have not hit the limit of how many even virtual targets we can have within the system, particularly monitoring displacements at different locations beyond just at the midspans, or if we were even at some point, we were questioning whether we were getting some kind of out of plane movement from within the deck. So we were able to post-process and look at the video measurements to go back. But yeah, so if that's what you're referring to, we were able to utilize the virtual targets in a unique way and even explore other aspects. And that's when we were able to even look at the graffiti and other points in the bridge to really connect the vision-based measurements. And I have not tried OpenCV. So Mustafa, I know we're on another committee, TRB. I'd be happy to talk more about that. I'm not as familiar with that, but I'm really interested in seeing how now we can even explore this work as we're understanding ways in which we can do load testing in an accurate, safe way, but even as we move towards this idea of digital twins and all these other things, how we can really connect the dots. So yeah, I think I kind of went on with that question there, Ben, if you don't mind.
No, yeah, do it. I had a quick question. You had mentioned that you had issues seeing all of the girders, and I was out of curiosity. Does that mean you needed another camera or two, or is it just the camera's field of vision is not big enough?
So with our naivete being our first test, so we could have moved the cameras back a little bit, but we were trying to also see if we could capture the strains for that first test, which is why we were trying to be closer. So a third camera would have definitely sealed the deal for us, but we could have been a little bit more strategic with the placement of our two cameras to actually put them a little offset, but so that we could still be at a perspective view to get all of the cameras in one shot. We just went in because this was our first test. We went in trying to do too much, and we were still understanding the limitations of the system. But I think a third camera could definitely be helpful, and definitely planning and understanding the shots before. So that might add maybe about 10 or so more minutes to making sure that not only do you have a good shot, but also that the lighting, and even if a cloud comes or if the sun comes up, making sure that doesn't totally affect, because if that happens during the measurement, that could also affect the results. But I think it was just more of our kind of inexperience when we first started. But looking back, a third camera would have been phenomenal, but we could have done it with two cameras with more informed positioning.
Very cool. Thank you.